Hello, hello. Of course, let's see. Hi. Okay, so just gonna wait a few moments. I admit I was playing with my dogs outside and I lost track of time, but we're still on time, so that is good. Um, hello, hello, hello. Okay, here we go.
Ooh. Hi.
There we go. Hi.
Yay. Hello, good evening.
Hi. How
How
are
are you?
you?
I'm okay. I'm glad you were like a moment late because I had to finish shoving dinner down my throat.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, don't be. Like this was perfect. I like just came downstairs to have quiet and here we are.
Well, that's a good thing. That is definitely a good thing. We like it when the universe looks out for us. So,
Absolutely. Ooh,
um, you're kind of breaking up a little bit. Is it me or
it's probably me. Hold on a second. Ah, sorry.
that's okay?
Okay, there we go. It's probably me. What I had done last time is I can turn my video off and I then my sound is more fluid.
Gotcha.
So I
That's
say that,
okay.
but I of course have to then figure out how to do that.
That's okay. All good. Well,
No, that's
happy
not.
Tuesday. Okay. There we go. Okay, well, happy Tuesday.
Yes.
Um, so I am so excited. I know as we continue to have the conversation or get into it, we'll have more people join us, which will be really exciting. As after the event, I will, once the video gets downloaded, it'll be posted to my YouTube channel, which will have the closed captioning on it. So people will be able to access it through the link in my bio,
Cool.
as well as I think
And I'm
one
gonna
other thing.
just
But
run
so
up. I'm gonna run upstairs to be outside and hopefully have some better reception by doing that so
okay,
that my video doesn't lag. And it's a
not
much
a
prettier,
problem.
it's a prettier background too. Um,
Not a problem. I'm pretty flexible.
okay, hold on. Let me get to. This is not as pretty. There, pretty background.
Awesome. I love the nature.
Yes, yes, we can pretend we're in the woods.
I'm game. I'm game. So I am so excited for our conversation tonight because Dr. Julie Bindeman and we've been having conversations over the past year, 6 months. I don't even know how long it's been now. And she was a guest speaker on our mental health and pregnancy after loss and just dealing with pregnancy loss back in October. And she is an incredible asset to people who are going through reproductive health challenges such as fertility struggles, going through fertility treatment, pregnancy loss, and pregnancy after loss. Um, and she really helps to support people in all the ways possible with that navigation. as well as she's a member of the ASRM, which if you're watching, chances are you probably know, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine. And oh my gosh, like what don't you do? You provide support through Uprooted, correct? Right? You're still doing that.
Yep.
So, which is a Jewish organization providing support. Anything else?
I am part of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force for PALIDA,
Okay.
and Anti-Racism Task Force for the Mental Health Professional Group within ASRM.
Okay. Very cool. Yeah, that's great. That's great. So, okay, so let's just dive right in because
Yeah.
I've been reading a lot of people on social media lately within the community have really been honing in on this topic, and that's why I was like, okay, this is really good that we're covering this now. So a lot of people are talking about, communication struggles within their partners, their, fertility treatment really puts their relationship and their marriage to a test. And, sometimes people feel like they're on the brink of divorce or separation um, because a lot of it is communication within the two people that are involved, but as well as with the lack of intimacy that takes place when people are struggling. And so for those who are watching, if you've never struggled with fertility or you've not dealt with a pregnancy loss or a pregnancy after loss, there's a lot of no-nos when you're going through this journey, especially when you are going through fertility treatment or even after. Everything is on a timeline that you have no control over. And it definitely, especially with a lack of sex or other types of intimacy connections, or the lack of desire of it because your mental health has been impacted by this journey. And that is really, really hard. And I mean, sometimes the thought of holding your partner's hand is kind of repulsing, or just the thought of a peck of, a kiss on the cheek or on the lips, like there's just that sense of disconnect. And so I really wanted to make this topic come to life this week or this month. And Dr. Julie was like, I want to talk about it. So let's bring it on. Let's dive in. What you got?
Yeah, I think one of the things sort of to put in context is that oftentimes a fertility struggle or pregnancy loss is the first kind of crisis and trauma that a couple has experienced together. And for so many people, it's the first difficulty they might have had in life. It's certainly not true for everybody, and I'm not trying to make that as a generalization. So when you are now forced to do something that's really hard and you don't necessarily have a template in which to do hard things with, you don't have that skill set to draw from, nor do you know how to talk about it. So if that's happening to two people simultaneously, it's almost like the blind leading the blind. So I just want to start there in terms of context, because I think that's really important.
Absolutely.
Another thing, and I appreciate how you said this too, Jessie, where so many people equate sex and intimacy as one and the same. That, with sex, there's always intimacy. And when we're talking, intimacy is coded language for sex. And they're actually two really different things, that they can be inclusive of one another, but they don't have to be inclusive of one another. You can have sex with someone and not feel intimate with them. It's just kind of something to do to blow off steam. And you can do something intimate that has absolutely nothing to do with genitals. So again, really important to just frame that. And most couples don't think about intimacy as something separate and apart from sex. So that's yet another vocabulary that they might be missing out on. That it's, what else feels good to me? What else feels good to my partner? And what is it like to explore those things? And that piece can absolutely come alive during a fertility journey if the people going through the journey are in a headspace to try it and to do it. And sometimes when sex is off the table and there's no pressure of sex, it can really open a whole lot of doors to do things that are very focused on the sense, your senses, what.
Yes, absolutely.
There's so many senses. We have 5 different senses, and how do we use them all? And how can we use them all with our partner? And so, what is it like to say, hey, let's have an intimate meal together? What does that mean? What does that mean for different people? And you know what? I imagine that if I were to speak with different partners, different couples, an intimate meal could look totally different depending on who I'm speaking to. So, that might be something to try. Or thinking about, what looks sexy, and that might be someone who's totally fully clothed, but maybe they've shared that, like, oh, I'm wearing something underneath. And so you have that sort of imagination piece to it too. There's so many other senses that you can light up. And that's, I think, the piece that people tend to miss. That sometimes closeness, physical proximity can be intimate. Sometimes sharing something that makes us really vulnerable can be intimate. So really being able to be expansive with how do we think about intimacy is so important, and will serve you not only for the fertility journey, but also once that baby actually comes, because guess what? You're going to revisit some of this stuff too. That's
Right.
and people are not like, yay, let's have sex. They're like, oh God.
Right. No, like, no, please stay away.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think that that's probably like, you definitely like drew in like more of like the partner piece, because a lot of times there's a disconnect because say the non-gestating partner feels the lack of the ability to do something during this journey. And then it becomes more, well, I'm not going to say anything because I know that they're already, riding the hormones from the medications, or they're just feeling really anxious or depressed, from having to go through all of this. I don't want to be one more person, but then I still have my own needs that aren't being met because I'm being cautiously, sensitive or aware of where they are. So it's like this, the friction starts to build up.
And I think here's where people forget that just because they're in a partnership doesn't mean that they have to automatically lose intimacy with themselves. And so
Yeah.
the really important thing to remember is that, ideally we all have a sexual relationship or an intimate relationship, and ideally both, with ourselves. Mm-hmm. And then from there, we can share that with a partner. And so one thing to consider is, how do I tap in again to that relationship with myself? That, if you have needs that need to be met, it's okay that your partner's not the one to meet them. There are other ways to get those needs met and still stay within the parameters of the relationship that you have. So,
absolutely.
I think that's something else that people just don't think about. They don't consider. It's not.
Where they have like the correct, right, absolutely. Or it's the sense of the guilt associated with the desire for whatever that may be. I think that's definitely a hot topic too.
I think for sometimes too, like if a partner were to say to a person who's trying to be the gestating partner, like, would you be okay if I pleasured myself tonight? Like, they'd be like, go do that. Or maybe, again, if you're looking for connectedness and intimacy, maybe that part is, I'm not really feeling in the mood, but can I watch? So that's a way too of building intimacy, even if it's not performing something that's sexual.
Yeah. And I think that the other thing is, you were talking about, as well, we both were talking about that, sex and intimacy don't necessarily have to be intertwined or connected within each other. And it takes me back, as I'm listening to you talk about this, it takes me back to college when they give out like the handouts of like, here are all the ways that you can be intimate with like your girlfriend or, your partner. And none of it involves sexual intercourse. And so like the Rolodex starts going in, okay, well, let's go mini golfing. Let's go for a stroll on the beach, or like, let's build something, like this is a time to start a new hobby together, or, go camping. Like there are so many different activities that, can be really hot in a sense of like, ooh, yes, like let's do that. And then it's also breaks the barrier for communication too, because there's a sense of comfort that's built up from when we felt like it was breaking down.
And to point out too that in some cultures and some religions, there's actually prescribed time, whether that's during a particular month or a particular time of year, where intimacy is actually condoned, and touch between marital partners is condoned, is sanctioned, I should say, up until a certain point when it's allowed to be reintroduced. So one of the pieces of that people speak to when that is a way that they practice is that reintroduction of touch is really exciting because it's been absent. So that might, again, like changing how we think about it, changing how we interact with intimacy is so important. It's the fruit of what we're talking about tonight.
Yeah.
And really being able to change our lens around it. So,
Yeah.
yeah, being able to think about these different kinds of pieces.
So how would you encourage, so say a couple is newly starting down this journey and sex becomes a chore because they haven't gone to, I know, right? Like who would have thought? There's, either they're still trying to conceive on their own or they're doing timed intercourse with the supervision per se of a reproductive specialist. Like how do you talk about that? Like it's so, I mean, I know from my own experience, it was definitely I thank my lucky stars every day for my partner who is like, hey, like let's just figure out what we need to do, and we'll make it what we can. We really worked on our communication around that, but I often hear from a lot of people that it's like I don't know how to even have this conversation, and I don't want it to be all right, hit the hay, like let's go, like we gotta go do it because the ovulation predictor kit says that like this is our optimal time. And it's just, that is such a buzzkill. I mean, let's face it, it is
Oh,
a major mood disaster. Like, yeah,
yeah.
it's not good.
Partners who are sperm producers absolutely feel that. They feel that sense of, oh my God, I need to have sex on demand. And I think maybe in other times of life that would have been really appealing. But when it's like, okay, drop trow right now, like we gotta
Yeah.
go. It's like, oh my God. And what tends to happen for people who produce sperm is it makes them feel really anxious. It's that performance piece of, oh my God, I have to do it. And I wasn't thinking about it. And there was no warm up. And so it's sort of interesting because sometimes I think the best advice for people is to not be telling their partner, all right, I'm gonna be ovulating in a couple of days, and just maybe on their own kind of plan, what might I do that can increase our intimacy? Is there a story we can create together? Is there, something that I can do? Can I send some text messages to build some anticipation? What is it that I'm able to do? Especially if it's a couple that has really hard time talking about it, I would suggest
Mhm.
talking about it not during ovulation or
Yeah.
not at the time when it's like you gotta go. I think that eradicates some of the pressure when you're talking about it during those times of the month that
Yeah.
are just less
The
necessary.
pressure is intense. Yeah. The pressure is like really intense. And then it's like you were saying, like the performance anxiety. It's like, well, what if I'm so stressed that like I'm shooting blanks? I mean, not to say that that's what's happening, but the partners do definitely have a lot of these thoughts of like, this depends on me. Like, even though we know that it's really both partners, physiology, but there's that sense of expectation, especially if we're talking about, a couple who hasn't gone through testing yet and they're still trying to like navigate and tread these waters of like, well, like, could it be me? Could it not be me? And then everybody thinks that they're at fault for things taking longer than the 6 months or a year to like conceive. It's definitely like you brought up like a really good thing. And I really like that, like, not talking about the OPKs. And it's hard because even if the partners want to know, it's like this, you're planning it. There's something you have to schedule around. And without realizing it, you're stressing yourself out even more.
And I think, I mean, it's sort of interesting because if I look at other times in marital life or in a couple's life where, you know, our sex drives rise and fall, our sense of desire rises and falls. Certainly when you are in the middle of child rearing, you know, one sex drive and one sense of desire, they tend to be not always so commiserate with one another. So
Right.
at some points in life, it's actually kind of nice to schedule it, to be like, okay, I know this is what we're going to do. And so that might be another piece too, that for some couples, scheduling actually might really work well because now expectations are known, they're really set, and okay, that's fine. And I think too, to remember, because I know so many couples are like, oh my God, that means we have to have sex every single day. And it's like, no,
No.
if you want to have at it, but if you're, you know,
Right.
might dilute some of the sperm. So looking at it as like, hey, can you try for every other day? You know,
Yeah.
and a lot of education too, especially for couples who might not have had any conversations with any doctor yet, and they're just trying on their own. What we learned in high school about having babies seems to kind of go out the window. I think the retained part is if you're on birth control, you won't have a baby. And the second you stop birth control, you will. And it's
Yeah.
not how it works. But,
Oh my gosh, can you imagine?
well,
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
over.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's part of the other challenge is that like sex ed doesn't prepare you how to talk to your partner and it doesn't tell you, I mean, the only thing they teach you is consent, yes and no, and then that's like it.
If that,
And so if that, yeah, if that, because some of them don't even talk about consent, which is that's a whole other episode with Julie and Jesse. But you know, I think that that's really, really important that we start teaching younger people to have that type of communication between their partner and whatever that looks like, even if it's a same-sex couple, like you still need to have that open communication of, you know, what does intimacy look like? What feels safe and what doesn't seem like a chore? And how do we communicate what each other is desiring, you know, for that time? And even if I think if you're doing like the schedule out thing, you can still make it fun and like interesting.
it's like
And
Taco Tuesday, you know, like how we tried at the beginning of the pandemic
yeah,
that we'd have different food nights perhaps during the week, just as a way of making it fun. So yeah, you can make it fun. You can mix it up. It doesn't always have to be the same. And it's okay if it feels like a chore. I think that's the other part too, is like if we're talking about expectation setting, it can be really important to know that this might not always be fun. This might
yeah,
feel like a drag sometimes. And that is okay. You might really have to like be like, oh my God, I'm so not in the mood tonight. But oh, she's ovulating, so I gotta, oh. And, you know, being able then to kind of look back on it and say, wow, like this wasn't easy. And we were really trying to do this together. And it took both of us. And, you know, I think especially couples who can laugh about it with one another, that really um, gives a lot of currency for the bank, if you will, that sort of
mm-hmm.
emotional bank. But being able to laugh both at ourselves and to laugh with one another can also, I mean, laughter can be really intimate too. So if we're talking about that, especially belly laughter, there's so many wonderful, wonderful things about that.
Can you touch on like one thing, one or two things about that that might be like a good takeaway from this for that?
In terms of laughter,
Yeah.
yeah. So laughter releases endorphins. Laughter brings out our playfulness. guess what? Sex releases endorphins and it brings out our playfulness too. So being able to start with laughter sometimes can end up in lovemaking and sex, in intercourse, and however we want to call it, and fucking, I mean, however we want to call it. So that's just something to think about, that, you know, how do we connect with people? Well, it's
Mhm.
not only with our bodies. We connect in all different ways. And so trying to remember, if we're looking at intimacy, we're looking at connection, we're looking at our senses. How can we do that? What can we bring into our relationship to foster connection?
Yeah, I think that's really important because that's been like a common theme that I've been reading on a lot of people's posts lately is like just a sense of disconnect and like, how do we bring that back in? Like, we weren't always like this before, you know, we had these challenges. And then it's like, okay, well, what can you do to reinstate some of that stuff before? And humor is definitely one of them. Going out for dinner or getting carry out, having a picnic in your backyard, dancing in the kitchen, like all those things to get some of that juice going for sure.
And I like to say to couples, like, fertility becomes a hobby, becomes kind of an obsessive hobby.
Yeah.
Another hobby, like, have something else too, that this can't be your only pursuit. It can't be sleeping, work, and fertility. And that's
Yeah.
kind of how life gets broken down for so many people. So
Mm-hmm.
what else can you do together? What else can bring you together? um, that What else can you talk about? Because I think that's the other part too, is all conversation starts to center around fertility and ovulation and doctor's appointments and shots and hormones and test kits and all sorts of things like that. So being able to have a place where we can talk that has nothing to do with that. And I recognize what I'm saying is so easy to say and much harder to do, because yeah, fertility is all encompassing. So I'm not trying to sit here all Pollyanna-ish, like, oh, it's so easy.
Right.
But the
Yeah.
couple have other things tend to fare better because it's not only fertility that keeps them together.
Yeah. And it also becomes something of, oh, I just lost my thought, but something else that you can, oh, I know what I was going to say. It can be like almost like um, scheduling, a self-care time or something like that on your schedule. This is like a no zone where we don't talk about any of the treatments. We don't talk about their fertility. We don't talk about how lousy everything is. This is just truly like a time where we can either reminisce on the times before, or we can talk about the news, we can talk about sports, we can talk about anything else, planning the vacation after the pandemic, like all of those things. But this is like a no zone time where we don't talk about it because it does become all consuming between two people. And then it's like, well, what else do we have to talk about anymore? Like,
Right.
do we have anything else in common?
You forget
Yeah.
the foundation that you have built when you sought your partner out in the beginning. And it's, again, the, there are things about this journey that can be so reminiscent to the other side of it when you're postpartum. Because one of the things I say to my postpartum couples is, okay, when you go out on a date, and if you can do that once a month, that's awesome. But when you go out on a date, you can speak about your child for 10 minutes. And after that, that's it. So,
Yeah.
putting that same kind of thing of like, okay, we can talk about fertility for 10 minutes. This is a fertility free zone. And that's
Yeah.
our
Boundaries. Yeah. And I think that's part of the other thing is that I often hear, at least from my clients and from people within the community, is that boundaries can be really hard within a relationship.
yeah.
And that's probably like a struggle. So then um how does one set up? Like, what are some terminology or some statements that are a good segue to talk about those boundaries or setting up those boundaries?
I think sometimes it's just simply asking, like, hey, I really would like for us to talk about our childbearing plans. Is now a good time, or can you let me know when it is? And then it doesn't feel like you're being railroaded and having that conversation. So I think the simple thing that we tend not to do is just ask.
Yeah. And I think there's often the anxiety that goes behind that too. It's like, well, if I ask, like, are they going to say yes or are they going to say no that we can talk about it? Or is there never going to be a time? And then that's when I would say, well, then how about you kind of think about finding yourself a therapist that you can both go to that can help facilitate the conversation and dialogue between the two? Because that's probably a highly recommended thing for people going through this.
Sometimes therapy is the time that couples talk about the things they can't talk about because they have that third person who can help and guide. And so sometimes it is that 1 hour of therapy where it's like, okay, I've been holding on to these 4 things and now is the time I get to talk about them because I feel like it's a little bit safer. And hopefully through therapy, a couple learns how to build safety with one another so that they don't need that third person to create the safety. So, the idea is that we give you the tools, we teach you how to talk, and then send you out because you have what you need.
Yeah, I think that that's probably something that really does need to be talked about more because couples do struggle with that communication. And it's not to say that, there's anything wrong with your relationship, but you just need some of the tools to work through the dialogue and having the conversation so that you can be on, the same wavelength, even though you're both on the same team, but you're not always thinking the same way, and to have the respect for each other because that's oftentimes another huge component. And I think we may have even talked about this back in October is that, like partners grieve differently, and the loss of having to build a family the way that you thought you were going to is a grieving process. And both partners deserve that safe space to be able to not have it experienced the same way, but to be able to express if they're able to, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's probably like an important piece to it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it goes back to kind of that original context that I spoke about, which is that
Mm-hmm.
so for so many people, this is their first experience with grief. This is their first experience with disappointment. This is their first experience with something really being hard. And if if you don't have any tools or any framework for that, how are you supposed to guide your partner about what is going on for you? Because what's happening inside of you is just so messy and so hard to pinpoint. And I mean, infertility is definitely a time when we have a lot of the both and kinds of feelings, where our feelings are not so crystal. They're not so determinable as a single entity kind of feeling. It's a sense of like, well, I'm feeling jealous that I just learned my friend got pregnant. I'm feeling a little happy for it too. I'm feeling hopeful that I might be pregnant this cycle. I'm feeling angry that it's taking so long. I mean, that's a mess inside of us. And it's so hard when we don't have that experience, those templates to try to sort through it.
So we just got a question. I don't know if you can see it.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to read it out loud for those who are watching. How do you create a space to communicate about grieving with the partner who is not the one trying to get pregnant, especially like in a hetero relationship? How do we help them articulate their grief?
So a lot of times I like to talk about disappointment, because if we're talking about men specifically, disappointment is sometimes a little bit easier to talk about than loss and grief. I think another piece is that oftentimes, and I'm making a hugely generalized statement, but I'm speaking from a very culturally narrow lens of it as an American. Um, our country doesn't do well in teaching emotional language to us. We don't do well accepting emotional issues or emotional language. We are horrible with grief. And so the templates people most commonly develop are: don't have those feelings, put them away. They, You're not like, yeah, put them in a box. You're fine. And so I think part of it is being able to have that partner start to trust that it's okay, that in this safe kind of space, and maybe we designate a room, or maybe we designate like some place that we go together. We're like, okay, here's going to be the feeling space, where we can write down feelings, or we can talk about feelings. I think the hard part is less about, or I guess it's a feature of communication that not everyone communicates verbally. And so are they communicating physically around what this loss might mean to them? Maybe that's a withdrawing. Maybe that is more intense neediness or affection. That's another way that people might communicate physically around grief and loss. Are they communicating with some of their actions? Like, are you seeing them turning more to alcohol? Are they withdrawing? Are they burying themselves more in work? Again, those are different ways that people communicate that's not necessarily verbal. And so it might be useful to have them write things down. I mean, I remember when my husband and I were going through our losses, I was just baffled that like this impacted me every single day. And about a week later, he was okay. And I, years later, was talking to him about it. He goes, yeah, my best friend came over. He came down from New York to make a special journey to be with me, came to be with me. We shot the shit all night. He let me cry a little bit, and that was it. And he's like, and that's what I needed. And so it's also knowing too that it might not be you that he needs to talk to, and can you give him the space and the grace for that?
Yeah, I was just going to say sometimes they just don't feel safe venting or spilling out to us, and that's okay. And that can be hard as a partner. And you're like, but I want to be that safe person. I want to be that safe space. Like, come on, like, why not me? But I mean, as with all things, sometimes we need our friends that are not our longtime partners. Like, there's a differentiation in that sacredness and that safety net for sure.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
yeah.
like one part of that is like about articulating grief. It also might be that like the articulation of the grief comes really differently. So it might be, again, nonverbal. Like maybe they're going and they're working out, and it's about how much can they lift, because that's how they get the grief out. Or maybe it's about running and how fast can I run? Like how can I sort of get into a place where I can be with the grief, but also be with the endorphins. So that's another kind of way too of being able to it's a different kind of articulation though than we think in terms of verbally, because I think we're really programmed to think verbally, like we verbal creatures. Let's talk. Sometimes men are like,
yeah, right. And then it's like, okay, all right, I got it. It's like, okay, see you later kind of thing. Yeah, I think that it's challenging because you find, for those that are in relationships with partners, that you find this person that you think that, you're going to be in the thick through, and that you're going to be able to talk about all the things. And it's just that everybody just processes things differently, for sure. And then there are partners that are more into wanting to talk about it than the person who's, physically it happened to. And that's a whole, piece to it as well, for sure.
absolutely. Yeah, it's always interesting when I work with a couple, and if it's a heterosexual couple, it's the guy who wants to talk about the loss, and the woman who experienced the loss is like, we just need to move on. And that's okay. I mean, again, it's not like there's a right and wrong with grief. Oftentimes what happens in these couples, and the ones that I'm sort of thinking about in my mind, that male partner's had more experience with loss and more experience with grief. So he has a template. He knows what these feelings are, whereas she might not. And so they're really scary to her. She doesn't want to talk about them, because what happens if she talks about them and can't stop feeling them? That's often the worry people have, is once I start talking, or once I start feeling these feelings, what if I can't shut them off?
Yeah. Yeah. And then that becomes a self-conscious boosting our anxiety and all of that that goes with it, that nobody wants to hear me and that I can't talk about it and all of that sort of stuff. And again, and then that's when I will interject in conversation is like, well, this is a perfect opportunity. Let's find you a mental health provider that, you know, you can have that safety net and be able to say the things that you want to spill out. Like, that's okay. And there's nothing wrong with it. Not that it's, you know, everybody's choice, but for those people who are struggling with that, like, I'm damned if I do and I'm damned if I don't kind of thing. And then it's like, well, then let's get you somebody that you can have that with, for
Yeah.
sure.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Wow. Well, these are like really great points. And I'm like so excited that we're talking about all the different senses in the way of being able to have that communication, and that it there's ways of working around the intimacy without sexual intercourse, which everybody tends to think is an automatic. And like I said, like I keep thinking, I'm just rolling back because I was an RA in college. And so we always had like these things they hand out to our residents of like, here are ways that you can be intimate without actually having sex. And then it's like all the things. So I'm like literally thinking, and I'm like, I hope I actually recycled those and I don't have them in my stash from college right now. It's like all the things you start thinking about because you're looking for new innovative ways of connection. And I think for us, what we did this past year was, I mean, we're always building stuff around our house, and like whether it's for our chickens, the gardens, or like new projects around the house or something like that, we totally redid one of the rooms and we built a Murphy bed from scratch. And that was so exciting. Yes. I mean, let me tell you, who would have thought that power tools were intimate and like very sexy? I mean, oh my goodness, let's just put that out there. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that was actually for us, like that was probably a really good thing because, diagnosis after diagnosis and all of these other things that were coming into play. And it was a great emotional outlet, got to hammer and drill and paint and do all of those things. And I had control. We both had control over something. So I'm a huge advocate of building something with your partner because it's something you can actually see the end result of within your means. And it's so exhilarating. Just a little tidbit.
Right. It's absolutely true. Like it's so concrete. And it's the
Yeah.
idea of can we go through a way like a gestation process where we start with the idea and we start with how we think we want to do it. We come up with a plan, we implement the plan and sort of doing the step-by-step piece of it. And at the end, we have this final result. Something got birthed. So I know that might be a little bit of a fraught analogy, but I did use it really purposefully, that there are lots of things that we can generate that might not be procreation, and that's okay. So being able to think about, well, wait a second, we're a good team. That's why we got together anyway. What else can we create together? While we're on this baby project, what else can we do?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's really important because it gives you a sense of like we completed something together and it was, our project, we made it. And there's a lot of validation that goes into the strength of that type of productivity for sure. Yeah. So I'm just checking if there's like any other like things, but it looks like people were excited. Okay. Anything else that we should hit on for any of this?
Um, I would say to people that if they are trying to conceive and they're not on some kind of assisted reproductive journey, so if it's prior to that, to remember to have sex outside of ovulation time. Just so, again, it keeps things kind of more constant, kind of more fluid. And so it doesn't feel like, well, it's the one time of month, let's go. Again, building up that intimacy too and finding other times. And I think too, finding times purposefully to abstain where we are saying, let's try not even to touch each other. That's a really, really hard thing to do. It seems like somebody just brought up a question, which is negotiating sex during trying to conceive. How do you not feel like a sex robot just for procreation? So that is such an excellent question. And I think, again, it's all in the setup. You know, how do we talk about it? If it's this idea of we only do this once a month, then yeah, you're going to feel like a robot. If it's like, okay, I'm ovulating, you know what to do, like, yep, you're going to feel like a robot. So I like to bring in the senses around sex. And so maybe for people too, it's mixing it up a little bit. Like maybe it's like vanilla kink, you know, okay, tonight one of us is going to have our eyes covered so we don't get the sense of sight. What is that like? You know, or okay, we're going to use massage oil or essential oils so we get to enhance that sense of smell. Or, you know what, we're going to have whipped cream or chocolate sauce, and wherever you put it, it's got to get licked off. You know, there are
Yeah.
ways to it in a way where it's like we can have fun and going back to play. Like I
Mhm.
come back to that idea of sex is supposed to be fun and playful. So how do we get back to playing? It's adult play, right?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. And that's, I think we get so inundated with like the check boxes that we forget, like, there's, even if you are going through fertility treatment and you know, the sexual intercourse isn't a thing, but maybe you have your partner be part of your injections, or maybe you incorporate some dancing, or like have them make a playlist for you. And then it's just, you know, like an intimate thing for you. And like, there are ways around that too, that you can still have that deep sense of intimacy even without the act of the sex.
Maybe they need to put on some sexy boxer briefs or something like that. Like, you know, it doesn't have to be, if it's a, again, heterosexual partner, it doesn't have to be the woman that's putting on these kinds of things. So
Yeah.
remembering, like, there's a lot at our disposal, and how do we make it fun? How do we make it playful again?
Yeah, you've got me like thinking about it. So
Me too.
right. I'm like, ooh, what do I have in the fridge tonight? But I think it's good to be able to laugh about it and to like think about like all the ridiculous things that you could do, and then actually trying that. It's like you've got nothing to lose except for, you know, a lot of belly laughs. And I think that as you were talking about, you know, with the endorphins, is like it helps us get back into that state of mind, and really helps, like, oh my gosh, like all the things. Um and by putting yourself in that position, it also opens up the verbal communication too, because then you have something to talk about that isn't just about trying to conceive, right?
Right.
And so,
Right.
yeah, like, you know, maybe you try role playing and you learn, like, oh my gosh, we're never doing that again. Or, you
Right.
know, it opens up a can of worms. Yeah, like you never know.
Right.
So,
Right.
I think, yeah, I think that these are all great. And so, Charlotte, if you have any other questions, you can definitely like throw them in the chat. So I have a question. So for, if people are wanting to dive more into all of this, what would their next step be, like after today? Like, because we have people who I've been seeing who are popping on that are not local. So how would they go about finding themselves a safe person? Is it just going through ASRM and like doing like a search for provider, or what would you recommend?
So going through ASRM and the mental health professional group is great. Going through Resolve, that's another organization, or Path to Parenthood has a therapy directory too, I believe. Um, Also looking at ASECT. So that is an association about sex therapists. And so
Yeah.
sometimes just being able to communicate and talk about sex, you know, depending upon how you grew up and where you grew up, and what that part of life was like, it might be really uncomfortable to talk about sex. And so being able to find someone who can help you with the words for it can also be really useful as well. Um, you know, I think it can be fun too to just explore the internet and, you know, start Googling like fun sex ideas, or you know, I like to start with the idea, again, like going back to the senses. So really talking to your partner and say, how do we explore our five senses? You know, and maybe the sixth sense of imagination, yeah, and being able to again concretely be able to tie on that.
I love that. I love that. So for those who are watching, this recording will also be saved to my YouTube channel. And with that, I will also list the other resources that Dr. Julie is talking about so that you can access those.
There's another
And
question that just got dropped, which is how to work on intimacy and feeling sexual when we are on a bunch of hormones, which, if we're all being honest, like vaginal suppositories and hormones are so not sexy. They don't make us feel sexy. They don't make us look sexy. And that's where I come back to the idea of intimacy is not about sex.
yeah.
Intimacy needs to be more than just sexual intercourse. So if you're not feeling sexy, then, you know, maybe that's okay that this is, you know, you're hopped up on hormones and you're not going to have sex. Maybe that's okay then to start with touching. Sometimes if you're just holding hands or you're using different senses, that can start to build desire. And typically, women, you're right, Dr. Lori, there is nothing sexy about suppositories. So, preach, lady. But being able, like, women need to rev up a little more to have sex, that we don't necessarily are all fired up and are ready to have sex. It takes a little bit of time for our brain to send the message down to our hormones to be like, hey, release some estrogen. Like, that causes lubrication. And especially if you're going through different hormonal treatments for fertility, that also might be difficult. So it's okay to have a nice handy thing of lube near your bed. You know, that's great. Go ahead and use it. There's no shame in that whatsoever. But, you know, building up to sex versus feeling like, okay, performative foreplay, let's go. So I go back to the senses. Sensate focus is such an important kind of tool that a lot of sex therapists will use with their clients, because it's a really great way of starting with the senses to build intimacy, to build trust, to build connection, so that there is a place for sex to happen.
I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Sugar the Shop in Hamden in Baltimore. So if you are local, like, they've got some really great resources to help with intimacy and give you like all sorts of ideas. And they've got a lot of great products that, you know, if you want to try some things out, they are probably the safest place that I've ever been and have worked with on some other things that I think I highly encourage you to check them out. And they are always having workshops, and their staff is really helpful. So whether you go or you give them a call and ask them for suggestions, like, they can do that. So they're not paying me to say this, but, you know, if we're talking about different types of intimacy, they definitely are like a great local place to check out. But yeah, so Charlotte, yeah, so senses definitely, yeah, it's a big thing. So thank you, Dr. Julie, for saying that, because I think we're all like, our wheels are going like, okay, what are we going to do now?
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. So thank you so much. Yeah. Right, Charlotte? Yes. Sugar. And they're so inclusive. Yes, they are. They're loving people. So if you've never been and you're in Baltimore or you're in Maryland, go check them out in Hamden. They're right on the avenue. Well, I am so, so grateful for this time with you. Like, this was like so much fun. I feel like we could talk about this stuff like all night, because now I'm like, wait, we're just beginning. But, you know, but it's true though, because this is such a big topic that reproductive endocrinologists, the doctors at the clinic, they're not talking about this stuff.
No,
And this is
at all.
so, so important. And I mean, how many times have we heard that, you know, relationships end in the middle of, during, you know, treatment, because the partners they can't see eye to eye, they're not communicating, and they've lost that sense of connection.
It's just too hard. Yeah. I mean, again, like, when you don't know how to deal with challenges, it's really hard to have to go through that.
Yeah.
And sort of, you know, the blind leading the blind, having to map it all out yourself, or having to try to map it out together and having totally different maps. So
Yeah.
absolutely, there's so many of us that are really well trained that we can be helpful in this, that many of us have had our own kinds of fertility journeys, so we get it from that kind of lived perspective too. But also we have a lot of training because all journeys are different.
Yeah.
So that's where ASRM and Resolve and Path to Parenthood are just great resources. Uprooted is another great resources for those that identify as Jewish. And the Jewish Fertility Foundation is another where there's like a matching kind of program where you can get a peer mentor. So, being able to find your tribe, right? Find the
Yeah.
people who understand.
Yeah. Well, I am so, so grateful for this time, and maybe we'll have another random conversation, about this, but I am so, so, so grateful for you being up for the task of this topic.
Absolutely.
I don't think I've ever had any therapist be so excited that wasn't a designated like sex therapist that was like, yes, let's talk about this.
Yeah, let's talk about it.
But it's so important. And I think that the more we start talking about it, the more we can normalize that there is a way of navigating intimacy through infertility and through pregnancy loss. And I think that that's definitely a conversation that needs to be continued within the community for sure. So
Absolutely. Thanks for
one
having
conversation.
me, Jessie. Always, always a pleasure to talk to
Yes,
you.
likewise.
Let's
And
definitely do it again soon.
yes, likewise. And thanks everybody for tuning in. And if you have any questions, you can always send them in and I'll make sure that Dr. Julie gets them and we can get them posted for another post. So, all right, everybody, have a fabulous Tuesday and enjoy the rest of your week. Bye, Dr. Lori. Bye.
Bye, everyone.